The Midwest is a far more complicated and diverse place than many realize. It is home to some of America's most progressive and LGBTQ-friendly states, while also containing some of the most backwards and anti-queer states in the entire country. Last week, we took a deep dive into the 6 best Midwestern states in the USA, with the top 3 in particular being some of the best places on Earth to be queer, ranking even higher than countries like Denmark, Canada, and Germany. But unfortunately, not all of the 12 states that make up the Midwest region are this incredible, and the 6 states we will cover today are rapidly regressing on the most fundamental of social issues, as they increasingly embrace evangelical theocracy, radical conservative ideology, and a weird obsession with opposing our community's right to exist safely and freely. As someone who has spent the majority of their childhood and teenage years in one of the states that we will be covering today, I understand firsthand what life can be like as a queer person in this part of the country, and why it is so important for us to accurately understand the world around us, so that we can use this knowledge in the fight for our survival before it is too late. And so, today we are going to dive into the data and explore the 6 worst Midwestern states for LGBTQ people in 2024. Now, the methodology we will use to create this list is simple. It begins with 2 of the most trusted and comprehensive organizations specializing in the measurement of LGBTQ rights: the Movement Advancement Project and Equaldex. The Movement Advancement Project awards points for both sexual orientation and gender identity-related legislation, and covers 7 different broader legal categories. The maximum points that a state can earn is 44.5, so as an example, a score above 40 is excellent. Equaldex, however, awards a maximum of 100 points, and takes public opinion data into account along with legislation. The scores that each state receives from both the Movement Advancement Project and Equaldex are combined and averaged so that we have a well-rounded final ranking that takes every relevant factor into account. I believe it is vital to always use multiple sources of high reputation instead of relying on only one, as to be confident that we are getting the absolute best data covering a wide range of relevant metrics. And for those who, like me, enjoy looking at maps and understanding the data, you can find links in the description to both primary sources. The information linked below is quite fascinating to peruse, and it is easy to look up information about any particular state that was not covered in today's video. And now we begin our journey in a state that has secured the best spot on this list of shame, coming in as the 6th worst Midwestern state for LGBTQ people in 2024, the state of North Dakota. But before we jump into the data, it is worth highlighting that in 2023 alone, 17 different anti-LGBTQ bills were put forward in the state legislature, and 11 of these passed into law. The North Dakotan government is completely dominated by far-right radical Christian politicians, and the state has voted for Republican presidential candidates in all but one election since 1940. And this one exception was back in 1964, just driving home how entrenched Republican ideology is within the state. Considering this, it is no wonder that the state of North Dakota finds itself in the bottom half of Midwestern states for LGBTQ rights. The Movement Advancement Project gives North Dakota an overall score of 8.75 out of 44.5, with a substantial gap between sexual orientation and gender identity-based legislation. There are no comprehensive anti-discrimination laws in North Dakota, and only 7% of the state's residents even have partial protections. The city of Grand Forks, located on the border with Minnesota, has a local ordinance against employment and housing discrimination, and is thus the only part of the entire state with any anti-discrimination laws. As a highly religious and Republican state, it is not surprising that North Dakota has even passed legislation legalizing discrimination against queer people on the basis of religious beliefs. Also, teachers in the state are required by law to out trans students to their parents, despite this often leading to immense abuse and bullying at home. Obviously, if a child does not feel safe enough to tell their parents about their transness, forcibly outing them puts them both in physical and mental danger. This is especially true considering that conversion therapy for minors is not banned in the state, meaning that queer children are frequently sent to what are essentially concentration camps by their right-wing Christian families. In these facilities, children are abused, manipulated, and psychologically tortured until they are willing to claim that they are no longer LGBTQ. North Dakota also still allows for the panic defense argument to be made in court, which is a vile and unjust practice where someone kills a member of the LGBTQ community and then claims in court that they only committed the murder because they, quote, panicked when they found out the person was queer, and thus often escape justice. Additionally, while trans individuals are allowed to change their gender markers on their driver's license after first gaining a certificate proving their transness from a medical professional, this is not possible on birth certificates, and no gender-neutral option is permitted on official documentation. Gender-affirming healthcare is technically legal for adults in the state, and Medicaid is mandated to offer coverage to transgender people, but beyond this, laws around trans healthcare are severely lacking. State employees do not have access to trans-inclusive healthcare, private healthcare providers are not required to offer trans-inclusive healthcare, and all gender-affirming care for minors is banned in the state. I have said this earlier in other videos, but I want to highlight the fact again that contrary to false Republican talking points, gender-affirming healthcare for minors does not include surgery. The narrative that trans people are being sterilized and mutilated is nothing but deceptive propaganda. The reality is that children are being abused and tortured in Christian-run conversion therapy camps. So, if they really care about kids, they need to focus on the real threat to their safety. It is also worth mentioning that North Dakota does have decent laws when it comes to queer families and adoption rights for same-sex couples, but overall, the state remains an incredibly difficult place to be LGBTQ, especially for trans people and queer youth. Now, Equaldex gives North Dakota a shockingly impressive score of 66, placing the state on par with countries like Greece, Costa Rica, and Slovenia. The reason why North Dakota pulls off such a score comes down to the fact that marriage equality is federally protected and thus applies to the state. It is also technically possible for trans adults to legally change their gender, and public opinion is actually quite high in North Dakota by global standards, with 59% of the population supporting queer rights. Higher than countries like Mexico at 56%, and Malta and Luxembourg both at 53%. So despite its pretty terrible statewide laws, North Dakota is above average globally, and if independent, would be in the top 40 countries for LGBTQ rights. Growing up in the Midwest, I have had the chance to visit North Dakota, and can honestly say that Theodore Roosevelt National Park is the only thing that makes the state worth a visit. Money spent in national parks does not go to the state, and does not support hateful Republican agendas, so visiting national parks, even in backward states, is an ethical way to visit parts of the country that otherwise should be avoided. Nearly the entire state leans red politically, including its largest population centers like Bismarck, Minot, and Fargo. And so, after visiting all of these cities, I can honestly say that until the legislative and political situation improves in the state, you are really not missing much by skipping North Dakota. Moving east now until we are very near the center of the Midwest, we arrive in a state that has secured the not-so-hot designation of the 5th worst Midwestern state for LGBTQ people in 2024. Put another way, out of the 12 states in the region, Indiana is ranked 8th for our community, slightly below both the national and the Midwestern average. Now, this fact is not at all surprising when one considers that apart from in 2008, Indiana has voted for Republican presidential candidates every year since 1964. Embarrassingly, the Republican supermajority in Indiana's state legislature has been focusing the majority of their energy in recent years on attacking queer residents and their rights. In 2023 alone, 18 different anti-LGBTQ bills were introduced in the state, highlighting the growing sway of radical evangelical zealots in Indiana. The Movement Advancement Project gives Indiana an overall score of -1 out of 44.5, with the state's performance on trans rights more than 5 points behind that of sexual orientation legislation. Indiana does not have any statewide anti-discrimination laws, but due to the fact that its urban centers are actually quite progressive, 33% of the state's residents live in jurisdictions that have local non-discrimination ordinances in place. But heartbreakingly, no such anti-discrimination laws apply to LGBTQ minors, and the situation for queer students in Indiana's schools is exceptionally terrible. There are no anti-bullying laws, and schools are banned from even mentioning LGBTQ issues or historical figures. And like North Dakota and other socially regressive states, Indiana also forces its teachers to out trans students to their parents, which has predictably led to incomprehensible domestic abuse and impossible living conditions. And this situation is actually worse for the queer youth of Indiana than perhaps in any other US state, as conversion therapy is not only still legal, but even the prospect of banning conversion therapy for minors in the future has literally been made illegal. This is genuinely wild, as Indiana is the only state in the country with laws banning the banning of conversion therapy. In light of this, Indiana is without a doubt one of the worst states in the country for young LGBTQ people to grow up in, and the grip of the religious radicals over the state's government seems to only be increasing. The fact that Indiana also allows for the immoral and wicked use of the panic defense argument to be made in court is also a grotesque display of the state's disdain for its queer residents. And while it is technically possible for trans adults to change their gender markers on their driver's license, if they can provide documentation from a medical professional, this process is troublesome, complicated, and even with such documentation, it is impossible for birth certificates to be amended, and no gender-neutral options are permitted under any circumstances. All forms of age-appropriate, gender-affirming healthcare is also banned for minors in the state, and neither Medicaid nor private health insurers are required to offer trans-inclusive options. But, on one positive note, state employees do have access to trans-inclusive health benefits, which is certainly a start. Now, Equaldex does give Indiana a score of 69, which once again may seem higher than one would expect, considering the state's very real shortcomings. But as with North Dakota, things like marriage equality, the ability for adults to legally transition without the need for surgery, and a public opinion score of 60, there are reasons why Indiana ultimately places quite well, alongside countries like Switzerland and Nepal. Now, over the years, I have actually spent quite a fair amount of time in Indiana, and had quite a few friends who called the state home. Like most US states, the cities and college towns in Indiana are quite LGBTQ friendly, at least generally speaking, and also consistently vote for progressive candidates. Some of my top picks for tolerable locations in the state include Bloomington, Indiana, which is the home of IU, West Lafayette, the home of Purdue University, South Bend, the city where this guy you may have heard of is from, and also various neighborhoods of Indianapolis, such as Fountain Square, Mass Ave, Broad Ripple, and Bates Hendricks, just to name a few of the more accepting areas that I frequented. But unfortunately, despite there definitely being some relatively progressive locations in Indiana, as a whole the state is incredibly religious and socially backwards once you leave the urban and educational oases of freedom and liberty. Sadly, the toxic politics and hostility towards our community that characterize Indiana's government often spills over into its liberal oases, and for this reason Indiana is not a state I would recommend anytime soon. But, for those who do visit for whatever reason, the Indiana Dunes National Park, located along Lake Michigan, is beautiful, the Hoosier National Forest in the southern portion of the state is lovely to hike through, and downtown Indianapolis does have a selection of queer-friendly spaces that are worth visiting should you find yourself in the state. Moving now to the southwesternmost edge of the Midwestern region, we arrive in Kansas, the state that has secured the less-than-ideal rank of fourth worst Midwestern state for LGBTQ people in 2024. Interestingly, Kansas has voted for Republican presidential candidates every year since 1940, with the only exception to this being the single presidential election of 1964, when the state voted for Lyndon B. Johnson. Kansas also has a Republican supermajority that has made attacking queer rights their primary focus in recent years. And in fact, in 2023 alone, the Kansas state legislature introduced 14 different anti-LGBTQ bills. Furthermore, the Movement Advancement Project gives Kansas a score of just 2, with its record on trans rights being even in the negative territory. Thankfully, due to the state's more liberal cities, 48% of Kansans are protected by local anti-discrimination laws that cover both sexual orientation and gender identity. But this is basically where any semblance of positivity ends, as the situation in Kansas, the home state of Westboro Baptist Church, is notably worse than even North Dakota and Indiana. For example, Kansas is one of only 4 states where it is literally impossible for trans and non-binary people to update their legal documentation in the state under any circumstance. The panic defense argument is still permitted to be made in the state, conversion therapy for minors has yet to be banned, and it is completely legal under Kansan law for religious fanatics to openly discriminate against queer people and to deny them services. On top of all this, it is nearly impossible for queer couples to adopt, foster, or start a family in the state, making the situation one of the worst in the country for LGBTQ parents. Shockingly, the state does offer trans-inclusive healthcare coverage to state employees, which is a pleasant surprise, but state Medicaid and private healthcare providers are not required to offer the same coverage, so in this area too much work is needed. Somewhat shockingly, with a score of 66 from Equaldex, Kansas does pull off a respectable score by global standards, but this is no thanks to the state's leaders, and comes down entirely to federal laws that happen to apply to every U.S. state, and to the fact that 58% of Kansans support queer rights, which is actually quite high when compared to countries like Greece, with only 39% support for our community. Now, Kansas is often thought of as just a flyover state that is not worth visiting, and honestly, its treatment of queer people alone just about validates this position. But it is worth pointing out that the northeastern part of the state is somewhat progressive, both in terms of voting patterns and social issues more broadly. Cities like Kansas City, Kansas, not to be confused with Kansas City, Missouri, and Overland Park, just to the south of Kansas City, are both considered to be quite LGBTQ friendly. Topeka, the capital of Kansas, also falls into this category of tolerant Kansan cities. Interestingly, the county containing Kansas's largest city, Wichita, voted for Trump in 2020 and is a less open and accepting city than many smaller cities like Lawrence or Manhattan, Kansas. But despite this, the urban core of Wichita is considered to be quite progressive and safe, all things considered. Kansas also truly does have some beautiful natural areas full of rolling hills that make the state more interesting than many realize. But despite the handful of progressive cities and picturesque natural areas, Kansas is without a doubt a state that is firmly under the boot of evangelical fascism and not a place I would ever recommend anyone in our community to visit unless they were to have a good reason to do so. Moving north now to the state directly above Kansas, we arrive in Nebraska, the third worst Midwestern state for LGBTQ people in 2024, coming in just 0.5 points behind Kansas. Now, as a state, Nebraska is without a doubt an overwhelmingly Republican one, but this comes with a small caveat, as it is also one of only 2 U.S. states that allows for different congressional districts to give their electoral votes to separate presidential candidates, instead of the usual system in the U.S. where the winner takes all. What this means is that while Nebraska is generally a stronghold for Republicans, and its 1st and 3rd congressional districts have voted Republican in every general election since 1964, its 2nd congressional district, which includes the city of Omaha, has voted Democrat in both 2008 and in 2020. Still, within the state legislature, Republicans hold a supermajority, and this predictably translates to some of the worst conditions for queer people in the entire region. This fact is sadly visible in the measly score of just 2 that Nebraska receives from the Movement Advancement Project. Only 25% of the state's residents are protected by anti-discrimination legislation, all of which live in the city of Omaha, the only jurisdiction in the entire state with such comprehensive protections. And like every other state on this list of shame, conversion therapy for minors is still permitted across Nebraska, and queer youth have no protections from anti-LGBTQ adults in the child welfare system. But on a rare positive note, Nebraska does not force teachers to out trans kids to their parents. Tragically though, but not surprisingly, age-appropriate gender-affirming care is completely banned for those under 18 in Nebraska, and as mentioned before, it is important to stress that surgeries are not a part of this best practice care for minors, despite what the far-right radicals would have you believe. Additionally, healthcare for trans adults is also nearly impossible to come by in the state, and while it is possible to change the gender marker on one's driver's license without the need of surgery, this practically cannot be done on birth certificates, and no gender-neutral options are available either. And lastly, just like Kansas, there are many barriers to becoming a parent as a queer person, and the state ranks as one of the worst in the country for LGBTQ people to raise their families in. Now, Equaldex gives Nebraska a score of 65, tied with Czechia and just 1 point ahead of Taiwan and Estonia. But as with every US state, the decent score Nebraska receives comes down to pro-LGBTQ federal laws and a public opinion score of 59, 20 points higher than countries like Greece and 10 points higher than Taiwan and Costa Rica. It is interesting to point out, then, that even the most backward states in the US have higher rates of public support for queer rights among the general population than the vast majority of the world. If only Republicans would stop obsessing over us and realize that the majority of Americans are not the religious fanatics that they are. Now, as stated earlier, Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District has become increasingly progressive in recent years, which is to be expected considering that it is home to Omaha, the largest city in the state. But this area in and around Omaha, going Democrat in the last presidential election, still elected a Republican congressman to represent them. And while it is without a doubt the most liberal part of the state, it is still far from being a queer utopia. And to a lesser degree, Nebraska's capital, Lincoln, is also architecturally stunning and a relatively safe place for LGBTQ people, but considering the overall political climate in the state, and in the rural areas around the city in particular, I could not in good faith recommend the city to any queer person, when there are so many better areas in the Midwestern region, particularly in the 6 states covered in the previous video, dedicated to the 6 best Midwestern states for our community. Still, if you ever do find yourself driving through Nebraska or visiting for whatever reason, it is worth noting that the state does have some gorgeous natural areas and parks that are worth exploring, with Chimney Rock being one of my favorite areas. Now, before we finish with the worst 2 Midwestern states for our community in 2024, I just wanted to ask you personally to consider becoming a citizen of the Queer Kingdom. Your help fighting for our future and building a strong, informed community is vital in our quest of making the world a safer place for our people. You can officially join the Kingdom here on YouTube for $1 a month, which will help me make the channel my full-time focus as soon as possible. The more time I can spend on content creation, the better I can serve the community. You will also get access to some cute custom queer emojis and epic crown icons next to your comments on this channel that change and evolve the longer you are a member. Also, monthly live streams are always public, but they are moved to the members-only feed afterwards. Controversial videos covering heavy subjects that are not quite YouTube-friendly are also privately posted for citizens of the Kingdom so that we can all stay informed. And finally, joining the Queer Kingdom here on YouTube gives you the ability to chat with me and fellow members through access to our new Queer Kingdom members Discord. I look forward to meeting you and working with you to create a safe and prosperous world for our people one step at a time. Moving now to a state that straddles the line between Midwestern and Southern, we arrive in the 2nd worst state for LGBTQ people in the region, Missouri, or Misery if you prefer, as it would perhaps be more accurate. Now, as someone who has spent a few years of my childhood living in the Ozarks, I am more familiar with the state than anyone should be, and believe me when I say that visiting Silver Dollar City as a kid was one of the only good things about living there. Since the year 2000, Missouri has voted Republican in every major election, and conservatives hold a supermajority in both houses of the General Assembly. Additionally, in 2023 alone, 48 different anti-LGBTQ bills were introduced in Missouri's state legislature, and that is the 2nd highest amount out of any state in the entire country, behind only Texas, which had 55. The Movement Advancement Project gives Missouri an overall score of just -1.5, with its score on trans rights in particular being especially terrible at -5.5, one of the worst in the country for this area. Only 18% of the state's residents live in places where they are fully protected from discrimination, with the cities of St. Louis and Kansas City being the locations with the most robust protections. Another 18% of the state is covered by conversion therapy bans for minors, which, while a start, leaves immense room for improvement, especially in the more rural, religious, and southern areas of the state. Now, here's the thing with Missouri's legislative situation. Literally every negative law that has been covered for the other states on this list apply to Missouri as well. So rather than mentioning them all again, I will simply highlight the one area in which Missouri is even more regressive in. Unlike the other states on this list that allow for trans people to change their gender markers on legal documentation without the need for surgery, in Missouri it is required, which means that the vast majority of trans people in the state will never be able to have their accurate documentation, as gender reassignment surgery is an undertaking that relatively few trans people choose to undertake. With 66 points from Equaldex, Missouri, like other states covered today, once again looks a bit better on paper just because of federal laws and the fact that Americans tend to be relatively accepting compared to most other parts of the world. But despite a public opinion score of 59, marriage equality, and other basic protections found in the Constitution and federal laws, Missouri is without a doubt a state in desperate need of further progress. Now, the three major clusters of progressive ideals and respect for personal liberty in the state can be found in and around the cities of Kansas City, Columbia, and St. Louis. Of the three, Kansas City is probably the most LGBTQ friendly and does have a small but vibrant queer scene. But being located in Missouri definitely puts a damper on the city's liberal credentials. Columbia, a college town in the center of the state, is also considered to be relatively LGBTQ friendly and is one of the few locations in the state where there are anti-discrimination protections. The last major center of queer acceptance in the state is St. Louis, a city that honestly has a pretty bad reputation for crime and has been hit especially hard by demographic and economic issues over past decades. But in recent years, the city does seem to be on the road to recovery, with decreasing crime rates, a growing economy, and increased investments into housing, infrastructure, and local businesses. Other important cities in Missouri, like Jefferson City, which is the state's capital, and Springfield, the largest city in the south of the state, both remain quite socially backwards and are not places I would personally feel comfortable recommending. But while the rural parts of the state are undoubtedly less accepting to those who are not far-right religious MAGAites, the Ozarks, especially near the border with Arkansas, is genuinely a beautiful area full of pristine forests, small mountains, and many sizable lakes. But at the end of the day, as someone who has spent a decent chunk of their childhood in the state and has needed to return from time to time over the years, I can speak from both statistical and personal experience that Missouri is without a doubt the second worst state in the Midwest for our community, and until things massively improve, it is not a place worth your time or money unless you have a good reason to be there, like family, work, or something of this nature. And now we at last arrive in the absolute worst Midwestern state for LGBTQ people in 2024, South Dakota. Now, the fact that the governor of this state is banned from visiting all 9 areas of tribal land in her own home state pretty much sums up the political climate in South Dakota. The state has voted for Republican presidential candidates in every election since 1968, and also has one of the most extreme Republican supermajorities in all America within its state legislature. It will likely come as a surprise to few, then, that this state receives the absolutely atrocious score of -5.5 from the Movement Advancement Project, and is one of only 5 states in the entire country with a negative score even in the area of sexual orientation. Now, the small college town of Brookings is the only jurisdiction in the entire state to have any local non-discrimination laws, and unfortunately, only 3% of the state's population lives in this city, meaning that essentially no anti-discrimination laws exist for the vast majority of the state's residents. And on top of this, not a single location in the state is safe from conversion therapy for minors. Now, sadly, the fact of the matter is that literally every negative law we have covered in this video applies to South Dakota as well, and this is why they are the worst state in the region. This obviously means that the panic defense argument is still legal in court, gender-affirming care is nearly impossible to legally receive for both minors and adults, changing one's gender marker on official documentation is also highly restricted and requires lengthy medical paperwork from various professionals to prove one is trans enough, and no gender-neutral options are available in any circumstances. Additionally, no hate crime laws exist to protect our community, schools are banned from discussing LGBTQ subjects or individuals, and religious freaks are permitted by law to freely discriminate against queer people, and the list goes on and on. Furthermore, Equaldex only gives South Dakota the relatively decent score of 67 because of reasons we have already discussed for other states. Reasons that are out of South Dakota's control, meaning that if the state were independent, its score would likely drop rapidly as soon as federal laws and protections cease to apply. Still, for now, the state does pull off a decent score, helped in part by the fact that 58% of the state's population supports queer rights, which, while below average by national standards, is actually quite high when compared internationally. In my personal opinion, as someone who has spent a fair amount of time in the state over the years, for various reasons, I can honestly say that Badlands National Park is perhaps the only part of the state worth visiting. It is both because it is truly gorgeous, but also because all the money spent in national parks goes to the National Park Service and not to the state in which they are located. Not a single county, with an urban center even in the state, votes for progressive candidates, and even the largest city, Sioux Falls, is not a place that can be considered LGBTQ friendly. The sad truth is that South Dakota is not only the worst Midwestern state for our community, but is in fact one of the worst in the entire country, really only behind a collection of southern states. It is essentially an honorary member of the Deep South and of the Bible Belt, despite not being in these geographical areas. It is a state in need of enormous social change and development, and until this happens, it is simply not a safe place for our community, and one best left avoided. At the end of the day, the Midwest is not nearly as monolithic as some people assume. It is a region that is home to some of America's most progressive states, like Illinois, Minnesota, and Michigan, while also containing some of the country's most conservative and backward states, like South Dakota, Missouri, and Kansas. Perhaps the main takeaway from this video should be that while our community has certainly achieved much in this country over recent decades, especially at the federal level, the fight is certainly not over, as much of the country is still opposing our fundamental right to exist freely and safely. And until the entire country is a place where we are truly free, America utterly fails to live up to the ideals and mottos it so brazenly claims to stand for. And now, for today's queer news story, we have an encouraging development within the European Union, where its top court ruled that all member countries must recognize legal gender changes processed in other member states. Meaning, in simple terms, if a trans person changes their legal gender in one EU country, like say Denmark, that gender change must also be recognized in other member countries, such as Bulgaria, even if said other country does not allow trans people to change their legal gender. This ruling happened on October 4th, when the European Court of Justice sided with a transgender man from Romania who had sued his home country for refusing to accept the name and gender identity changes that he had completed while living in the UK, back when it was still a member of the EU. The court agreed that Romania had violated his rights and that they must recognize his updated documentation. This is of course a huge win for trans people and our community as a whole within the European Union. The EU prides itself for its support of human rights and equality, but many member states continue to persecute our community and disregard calls from Brussels to respect their queer populations. And so while this ruling is at least a step in the right direction, trans people in these more primitive-minded countries are still unable to change their legal genders unless they do so outside of their home countries. Still, this court ruling is a move in the right direction, and some progress is better than no progress. Hopefully in time, the more socially regressive parts of the Union will either agree to respect our community's right to exist, or leave the bloc altogether. Thank you, friends, for watching and spending time today with me, as we seek to spread the word about important topics in the community. For those interested, you are more than welcome to stay around and join our increasingly powerful kingdom here on YouTube as we fight for our future. Until next time, QK out.